Hey, welcome to part 2 of how to make a D&D world map. In part 1, we ended on this, mostly just adding in some big features of the land, so lakes, mountains, different forests, and kind of hills. Today we're going to be doing civilizations and regions, but we're going to start that off by adding in some rivers. The reason we're going to be starting with this is because civilizations are pretty much universally founded around a source of fresh water. And what better source of fresh water than a river? One thing to keep in mind when making your rivers is that water is always going to flow down unless there was a wizard who cast a big spell and cursed the land. That could be kind of a fun adventure start. I don't know. So water is going to start up in probably the mountains and run down where it's going to collect into different lakes. But eventually it's going to keep making its way to the lowest point, which typically speaking is going to be the ocean. Another thing to keep in mind is that in general, rivers are going to be merging. So a bunch of small streams will merge together into a larger river as it goes downstream and towards the pool that it's going to, as opposed to splitting. That's one thing people on Reddit are super keen or critical about. Is that rivers mostly aren't going to split. They're always going to be merging and forming bigger and bigger rivers. Keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and add a few rivers. This doesn't have to be anything too crazy. We want to just add a few of the big ones because, like I said previously, this is a large continent map. In your regional maps, you might have smaller streams and stuff, but for this, we're just going to worry about the really big ones. Now that you've got your rivers in place, it's time to start adding some civilizations. So this is going to include any towns, villages, or larger cities and capitals. I decided that for the size of the map I'm working with, I wanted it to be split up into 2 different kingdoms. That means there's going to be 2 capital cities and a couple of other cities that fall under the same kingdom's rule. In total, I'm going to want around 6 to 8 cities for a map of this size, just so that there's enough room to add in some other stuff without things getting too crazy. When deciding where to put your cities on the map, you certainly could just pick somewhere and put a bunch of dots, but I think it's more important to think about this kind of from a world building and actually how the civilizations would have formed perspective. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, civilizations are going to be built around resources, primarily water, food, or resources that are important for industry. So take a look at your map and think about what you've got going on. You might have a civilization that's placed up in the mountains, and it could be based around mining and industry and refinery and smithing. Civilizations that are placed on coastline or large lakes could be primarily based on fishing or trade. Or any civilizations that are based in the forest could be centered around hunting and gathering or selling and trading meats and furs or forestry, timber. So these are just some things to keep in mind. There's nothing wrong with putting a civilization smack dab in the middle of nothing, but as you're moving forward in world building, you're just going to be asking yourself, why is this here? Why did people choose to settle at this spot? There's pretty much always going to be a reason, and usually it has to do with proximity to valuable resources, either for survival or profit. I'm going to start by placing the capitals. What are the 2 best positions on this map? So I think right there looks pretty good. They'll be a bit bigger. I think right there looks pretty good. Okay, super. So where are some other places that civilizations might occur? Well, I think there would be one right there. I think one right there. I think there would probably be one like right there. I think there might be one right here. And also up here. definitely gonna be one up in these mountains. Maybe out here too. Okay, so this capital has 1, 2, 3, 4 civilizations. This capital has 1, 2, 3. So maybe let's add another one in. Let's add one down here. Kind of call it in the foothills. Yeah, we'll place it just right there. Hopefully now you've got some rivers placed and some civilizations placed around those rivers and also where resources are going to be in your world. Here's what I've got going so far. Hopefully yours looks kind of like that. It's certainly starting to come along, I think. I got a little trigger happy when I was placing civilizations down, so I knew I was going to have 2 kingdoms, each with a capital city. But then I ended up giving each of those kingdoms 4 smaller cities or villages that they're going to kind of rule over. So I ended up with 10 civilizations in total, but that's okay. That's kind of the fun of it, is you're really just figuring it out as you go. The next thing we're going to do that's going to finish out part 2 of this series is actually coming up with names for these cities and just regional names in general. For me, coming up with realistic fantasy names, which is kind of funny, it was one of the hardest things, and I would come up with something and it just felt dumb or it didn't seem believable. So I came up with a few different methods that'll hopefully just make this a really smooth process, and you'll come up with some pretty cool, unique names. The first method that I use for naming is based around what the civilization or the town is actually doing or what they're all about. For example, I'll just look at a singular town on the map. So I'll just look like at this place here. And I'll think to myself, what could that be? What could that town, what are they all about, you know? Which at this point does require a little bit of imagination, because this one is 3 trees and a dot. Not a lot to go off of, really. I decided last video that these little trees of this variety are maple trees, probably. So, okay, so now I get to thinking. There's a civilization that is surrounded by a bunch of maple trees. What do maple trees remind me of? Maple syrup. Okay, so maybe this town makes a bunch of maple syrup, and it's really good. Or maybe they, it's just some magical syrup, or they have alcoholic maple syrup or something. That's kind of the base of this whole town. Okay, so you get to thinking. So, a town that is based on maple syrup, they're probably going to have sap everywhere, and it's just going to be really sticky. So sap, sticky sap. Sticky sap, sticky sap, sticky sap, key sap, key sap, key sap, key sap. And just kind of play around with some of the words that are relevant to this town and just say them over and over again until you come up with something. So mess around with the spelling, change out a few letters, whatever you got to do. But I ended on Kisabo, which I think sounds pretty believable for a town that makes maple syrup and maple syrup accessories. Another example could be for this town down here in kind of I would like to imagine this as like a tropical region, good vibes only, sandy beaches, very laid back type of people. So one of the things you'd experience there is just a nice palm breeze blowing in the wind. So I said to myself over and over, palm breeze, 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 palm breeze. And that's what I ended on. It's kind of silly, and people might think that you're going insane, but you're just coming up with names. So this place I decided to call Palmbury. A final example using this method is for this place up here. This kind of dense forest and little lake hideout. I thought, wow, that looks really nice. It reminds me of just, going up to escape into a cottage or a cabin in the woods. So, okay, escape. I thought woods, now that doesn't sound good. So leaves. There's probably some leaves there. I know I drew pine trees, but there's other leaves, I'm sure, other types of trees. So a leaf, an escape into the leaves. Leaf escape, leaf escape, leaf escape, leaf escape, leaf escape. Leafeska, Leafeska. And that's what I settled on. So that little town is called Leafeska. And again, with this one, I messed around with how it's spelled. So that one I spelled Liffeska with the accent mark over it. Leafeska. Just so it's not completely obvious where you got the names from. But if players do notice, I mean, more power to them. Maybe you can give them inspiration or something. Another method for naming civilizations, if that's not your cup of tea, is to use root words or suffixes, and a lot of these are pretty reminiscent of real life things. Here's just a few examples. I got a little list going. Helm, gate. Keep, fort. Guard. Ton, like Edmundston or something, I don't know. Ville, land or borough, like Queensborough. That I think is a real place. So you can use some of these, or you can also just combine regular words. This is also something I've noticed just looking at maps that happens with real life. People were like, oh, we're at the top of this mountain peak, and there's an eagle. Let's call it Eagle's Peak. And that's that. You can just come up with things. Another example of that is just like Pine Grove. Just take two words that literally describe the place, put them together. Using these different methods or strategies and a combination of them, go ahead and name all the different civilizations in your thing, from the capitals to the cities to the little villages. Anywhere that you put a little dot or a star, which is what I did for the capitals, come up with a good fitting name. After that, you can go ahead and do the same process for any prominent rivers or lakes that appear on your map. And feel free to include some fantasy stuff too. You know, instead of Eagle's Peak, it could be Dragon's Peak, or one of your rivers, it could be Kobold Creek or something, if there's a lot of kobolds in the region. The more flavor or descriptive names you use on your map, the more excited your players are going to be when they're looking at their map, because they can see somewhere called Kobold Creek or Dragon's Peak, and they have a pretty good idea of what might be happening when they go there. Aside from unique names of cities, places are usually named for a reason, and oftentimes it has to do with what's at that location. With those in place, you can go ahead and name some of the more prominent, larger things on your map, such as a mountain range or an ocean or a bay that one of your cities is located on. Feel free to use a number or symbol on the actual place, and then at the bottom you can make a legend saying what the corresponding name for that number or symbol is. Remember that in the final part of this series, we'll be transferring it to a digital copy, so once we do that, it'll be much easier to name and rearrange any things in case there's not enough room. For right now, we just want to have the names of things chosen and kind of the general layout. We can tweak it a little bit later as we go. That brings us to the end of part 2. In part 3, we're going to be putting on different modes of transportation and trade routes, and also a few unique features to the map that are going to be almost little Easter eggs or things for your players to do in the end game, such as shipwrecks or sea monsters or giant storms or cracks in the earth. Thanks for watching. To read the full article, go to thealpinedm.com. If you want to support the channel, go ahead and pick up a copy of the ebook that I just came out with. It's all about starting a homebrew campaign, from making NPCs and doing plot hooks to what do you do when players act a certain way and finishing up campaigns. Thanks again. Enjoy.